Hello everyone, it's Lawrence here from Unicorn Reviews. This is our second chapter in how to go fast for dummies, and today we're going to have some fun with physics. Now, I first tried doing and showing this with a real car. That didn't quite work out. It's also quite tricky to do it in a game, so for our convenience I decided to grab one of my old RC rallycross cars. I know it's dirty, it doesn't even work because this wheel broke. But it should probably be good enough to give you a simple explanation on the important physics you need to know when you're doing a basic setup for your car in a video game. Now, there are going to be two main things to think about. One is friction, the other is inertia. Now the friction, there's going to be air friction, which is decided by the downforce, but the most important friction is the friction your tires have on the surface you're driving on. This friction is influenced by a lot of things. For example, under acceleration, the rear will be planted because there's inertia in the car. It won't move forward, so you get some sort of planting down of the rear effect. And then the front gets really light, so the front has less grip, but the rear has a lot of traction at that point, which of course then it helps with acceleration. But if you want to turn under acceleration, it's really not going to go that well. The same really goes for braking. So when the front is planted, the front won't slide around, but the rear is pretty light, which when there's different amounts of grip, or you brake very slightly uneven, your car under braking will start to get a bit wobbly. Of course, you also don't want that. You'd say the easy way to fix this is by making your suspension stiffer, but when you make your suspension stiffer, you get less of this wobbling around and everything. But when you then have a bumpy road, your car will just bounce around instead of using the suspension to absorb the impact you give the car. So when you're making a setup and you're choosing how stiff you set up your suspension, it's quite important to have a good consideration for how bumpy the track is, because stiffer is not always faster. Now, this is just from front to back, but the same happens left to right. So if you're turning, the inertia will want your car to keep going. A grip on your wheels makes the car turn, so more weight is being put on the outside area of the car. Now, again, you can stiffen your anti-roll bars and the car will stay flatter, but that again comes with the bump issues. It's pretty much always the same when setting up a car. It's always stiffness versus bump and drivability, because if you make a car really stiff, the suspension isn't going to do much anymore. Alright, so that was pretty much it for basic suspension setup. Let's now have a look at aerodynamics and how those influence your car. Air will always try to rush over your car instead of go underneath, which kind of really isn't what you want, because you then get low pressure on the top and higher pressure on the bottom. You kind of want the opposite. When there's higher pressure, obviously it's going to push the car down into the tarmac. Now, you can do that with something like a massive rally wing here, but that of course creates drag, which lowers your top speed. So it's all going to be about creating the lowest possible downforce that you can still drive without losing too much speed in the corners. So you have to find this balance. Now, normally less downforce is always going to be faster, because the top speed disadvantage you have will easily cancel out any corner speed you can carry when you have a car with a lot of power, one that accelerates rather well. So it's all about finding a right balance. Just like with the suspension, everything's about making compromises and getting a proper balance with your car. Alright, we now have a decent suspension setup and a decent aerodynamic setup. A really important thing when you're tuning your car is getting the diff settings right. When a car is going to accelerate, the way a diff works is when one wheel is spinning, the other wheel can just stay stationary rather easily. Now, with this car, sadly it rotates in the other direction, which isn't really a good example. But what you want is a car that when you're turning, you want the outer wheel to spin slightly faster than your inner wheel, but not too much faster. You can control that by setting your acceleration lock. Now, the higher you set that lock, the more force it takes to get two wheels to spin at a slightly different speed. Of course, lower, and they'll rotate along easily, so almost to a point where you have an open diff, which is, you know, the situation where one wheel can turn with the other one being stationary. Kind of not a really good thing when you want to go fast. You get a similar thing under deceleration. And there's also, you know, under deceleration it's even more important, because if these wheels are going to drag when turning in under deceleration, they're going to want to make the rear of the car slide out, like we saw with braking, because the inertia wants to keep pushing the car around. So diff settings also very important, and you'll have to balance them out pretty well. Alright guys, now I realize that for a lot of you what I just said might be a bit, you know, how do you translate it into actual game stuff now? Pretty simple rule with your tire pressure. If you put the front tires slightly softer than the rear, so you're going to have slightly more grip in the front than you have in the rear. But you then also have to keep in mind how, with the heating, you know, if the tire gets used more, it gets hotter, so the pressure goes up. So it kind of evens itself out. So if you have a good 50-50 weight balance, you should, and same size tires, you should probably keep the tire pressure similar. Now, next thing, ride height. Now we're still talking about front only here. So if you put the front lower than the rear, you will get better traction because of what I showed, where the car tips back or it plants itself down. And you know, by putting the front lower than the rear when decelerating, you also get a lot more oversteer. Now, spring rates, I mean, this is what I said, you know, you can make them really stiff and bounce around a lot. You can make them really soft. Now, if you make the front softer, then you can have more oversteer or less understeer. It's of course the opposite for the rear, but we'll go into the rear later. We then also have camber. Now, camber is the angle with which your wheels sit on the ground. So let's say your wheels are normally sitting perfectly flat. Let's get my hand somewhat straight. If you put camber minus, the car is here, by the way, so the wheels will sit out, so the top of the tire tips in and the front sticks out. That's negative camber. The reason you want that is because when the car pushes on the wheel, you know, you have to get it so under maximum load the car, the side of the wheel is perfectly perpendicular to the road surface. So you have to figure out how much camber you're going to use. Now, bump stop, not all games have this, but that's pretty much how low the car can go when the springs are fully compressed. Now, because you're using a spring, you're also going to use a damper, because otherwise it would just bounce around an awful lot. Now, pretty much the same thing as always. When you use when you set the rebounds and the bump softer, it's going to take a bit longer for the spring to compress and decompress. So if you have a bumpier track, you should do that. It's pretty much the same for everything. Now, caster is quite hard to explain, but you have to think of it as a multiplier for the camber. So what you should probably always do is set the caster to about as high as it will go, and then base your camber off of that, because camber, you know, when your tire tips in, it's also going to have less run surface, so under braking that's not going to be ideal. Now, front downforce is locked with this car. Kind of sucks for this video, but you know, obviously higher front downforce makes the car slower, but gives you less understeer or more oversteer. Toe angle is the way the wheels sit. So let's say the car is behind my arms. Toe in is when the car wheels do this, toe out is when the wheels do that. Pretty simple. It's of course also opposite rear as it is in the front, but when you put the front toe in, then the car is gonna turn in and out a lot faster. When you turn it out, you're gonna have a more stable car that responds a bit slower. Moving to the rear, everything with the rear is pretty much the exact opposite of what it is with the front, except for the bump stiffness, because a spring is still a spring. So now for our global settings. Now this is the differential settings I talked about. So stiffer acceleration means more oversteer, faster acceleration mostly, but when the tires do spin up, of course you lose a lot. And then of course this is again more oversteer the more you put it that way, simply because you know the wheels will lock when you turn in, and then the rear of the car will try to overtake the front of the car. Now you get a preload. This is pretty much something that decides how much force there is already on the differential. So if you set the preload higher, because there's already more load on there, it's gonna, you know, unlock or lock a bit faster. Alright, so when you've set your downforce, you have a limited top speed for your car. So that's where the gearbox comes in. Now you want your gearbox set so that it's the shortest possible gearbox you can get without hitting the ref limiter on the fastest part of the track. So again, it's compromising, you know, do I want to accelerate really fast or do I want a really high top speed? You're gonna have to figure out what settings you're gonna need, and every car is different, and cars with more gears make it a bit easier, but then you lose more time shifting, so it's all about compromises really. Now when you're at a really high speed, you're gonna need to brake. Now pressure, that's a personal preference. I like my brakes pretty high pressured, so you don't have to push the pedal too hard. And then you of course have balance, which is, you know, where the balance is of the car. So for that you just turn off your ABS if it's not off already, in which case you didn't listen to what I said at the beginning of the series, but okay. So you turn off your ABS and you just do some lapping, and if you say, well, the front locks up all the time, slide the balance a bit to the rear. If you say, every time I brake the car overtakes me, the rear of the car overtakes me, slide it a bit to the front. It's really that simple. Another thing is COG, which is the longitudinal center of gravity. So with race cars you always make them lighter than the regulations let you have them, so you have some ballast weight which you can then position in the car. So of course putting it in the front, you're gonna have more load on the front but also more weight on the front, so you're gonna have to play around a bit with that to get a perfect balance. Now the great thing about this is that it doesn't affect other settings, so you're not gonna have to use more downforce to compensate, for example. The next step is your steering ratio. Now this pretty much decides how much the wheels turn when you turn the wheel. Now I like mine really fast, so mine is probably most of the time 8:1, an 8:1 ratio. You know, that just makes it so that I don't have to turn the wheel an awful lot, because I use a really small formula-like wheel. It kind of helps that if you're driving like bigger cars, you're gonna go with a bit of a slower ratio, a larger ratio. So that leaves us with a few settings left. So we have fuel load. Obviously it's how much fuel you get on board. You should always use the least amount of fuel you can get away with, obviously, so it's quite helpful to do a lap around the track, or 3 or 4 laps, get an average fuel consumption per lap and then base your fuel load off of that. Lower is of course always better because it makes the car lighter. So now we only have some engine stuff and tire compounds. Now tire compounds will often come in soft, medium and hard versions. Project cars at the moment doesn't work like that, but the softer the compound, the longer the compound will last, which is not a problem if you're doing a very short race, and of course the harder compounds will last longer for endurance racing, for example. So you'll have to, if you're just going to go out for a very fast lap, you just use the softest compound you can possibly get. And then the only thing left is engine. So brake mapping is how much throttle your car gives when you're not giving throttle under deceleration, which is, it's quite a complex thing, but basically, as I said, you know, with the rear differential locking up under braking, brake mapping tries to solve that. So the higher you set the brake mapping, the more fuel you'll use, but your engine will also keep running while you're not touching the throttle and the RPMs are going down, or they won't go down as fast. So similar to using a heavier flywheel, but let's actually not go into flywheels because no game ever lets you adjust that. Now the only thing left is restrictor. Back like a few years ago, most race cars were made really fast, and then they had to make the engine breathe through pretty much a straw in order to not give them massive power and to balance the cars out. So obviously when a game allows it, you just set the restrictor as high as possible, so it doesn't, you know, so you had least restrictions what you want to go for to get optimal power. Because there are so many different sliders and options and different things you can modify about your car, I can't really put it all in a video, but I'm gonna link you guys in the description box thingy. I'm gonna link you to a pretty good tuning guide which was originally made for Gran Turismo, but it works on every game because every game has similar physics. One just executes it slightly better than another one. I tried going with the stock setup versus a custom-made setup, and from car to car and track to track, I was able to gain about 10 seconds on a 2-minute lap. So that is absolutely massive just by messing around with the tuning setup. So I want all of you guys, if you're really serious about this course, I want all of you to do a lap first, then really read the article I linked below. You'll be a setup wizard in no time at all, and when you've done that, you should go and do some more laps and just see just how much you improved, and just let me know in the comment area how much you improved. So I'm gonna sign off now, and we'll see you back in part 3.